You thought the hardest part was over when you signed the papers. The fighting stopped, the house was divided, and everything finally felt quiet. Maybe for the first time in months or years, you could breathe. But what no one tells you is that the silence after divorce isn't always peace. Sometimes, it's the calm before a storm you never saw coming. Because long after the lawyers disappear and the signatures fade, the consequences of a rushed or unfair settlement begin to surface. Not with a bang, but with slow, creeping damage that shows up in your bank account, your living situation, your ability to retire, or your relationship with your kids. At first, it's small things. A bill that wasn't supposed to be yours. A custody schedule that suddenly doesn't work. A promise that someone swore they'd keep but didn't put in writing. Then it's bigger. A missed pension payout. A house you can't afford to maintain. An agreement you can't reverse no matter how unfair it feels now. You didn't just divide your life. You signed away pieces of your future. And by the time you realize it, the window to fix it has slammed shut. Most divorce settlements don't explode right away. They haunt you quietly. You carry the weight of what you didn't fight for, what you didn't understand, and what you didn't ask the right questions about. And years later, when you're trying to rebuild, those missing pieces start to show up in all the wrong places. This video is your warning shot. Here are 9 signs your divorce settlement will haunt you for years. And if any of these sound familiar, you need to pay attention. Because the real damage doesn't happen during the divorce. It happens after, when you think it's over, and it's not. You agreed to the terms just to get it over with. That alone is one of the most common and most devastating mistakes people make during divorce. At the time, it feels like the only way to survive. You're exhausted. Every conversation turns into an argument. You just want it to end. So when the settlement hits your desk, you skim it. You sign it. You tell yourself it's fine. Maybe not perfect, maybe not even fair, but it's done. And that moment of relief feels like a victory. But that feeling fades fast. Because what you signed in a moment of fatigue now becomes legally binding. Maybe you didn't fight for retirement assets. Maybe you gave up too much equity in the house. Maybe you agreed to support payments you can't afford long-term. At the time, it all seemed worth it just to make the noise stop. But the noise comes back, just in a different form. It shows up in unexpected bills, in custody conflicts, in financial stress that builds slowly and never lets go. And here's the part that really stings. Courts rarely go back and change what you agreed to, unless there's proven fraud or a major legal error. I was stressed, or I didn't know what I was signing won't hold up. You're locked in. That moment of emotional surrender now lives in permanent ink. So if you rush through your settlement just to escape the chaos, that peace may have come at a cost. Because what felt like closure was actually compromise on your future, your finances, and your freedom. And the regret doesn't show up all at once. It creeps in year after year until you realize that quick signature may have been one of the most expensive decisions of your life. You gave up retirement assets without fully understanding them. It's one of the quietest financial mistakes and one of the most brutal to recover from. In the heat of divorce, most people focus on immediate, visible things. The house, the car, the custody schedule. Retirement accounts feel distant, abstract, even boring. And when someone says, you keep the 401k, I'll take the house, it sounds fair on paper. But decades later, that fair trade doesn't feel so balanced. Here's what most people miss. Retirement funds grow. A house costs money. It needs repairs, property taxes, insurance, and constant upkeep. Meanwhile, that retirement account you gave up, it was silently compounding interest, untouched, preparing to carry someone else through their golden years, while you struggle to catch up. The time it took to build that account isn't something you can just recreate overnight. And the older you are, the harder it gets to rebuild. You can't fast-track decades of saving. And it's not just about losing half. Many people don't know how to properly calculate the real value of pensions, IRAs, or 401ks. A $300,000 retirement account might not look as exciting as a home with the same value, but in 10 years, it could be worth far more. Worse, some waive rights to retirement assets completely just to make things easier, not realizing they just walked away from the only financial security they had for the future. It's a slow burn. You don't feel the pain right away. But the day you start planning for retirement and realize your balance is half of what it should be, or worse, missing entirely, that's when it hits. You didn't just give up money. You gave up years of stability. And there's no settlement clause that refunds lost time. Your child support or alimony terms aren't fixed or clearly defined. At first glance, the numbers seem reasonable. Maybe you agreed to a monthly payment, maybe the court ordered one, but you didn't think much about the long-term structure. It's just a number, right? Something you'll handle month to month. But what many people don't realize is that if those terms aren't locked down with specific, enforceable language, they can turn into an open door for future conflict, renegotiation, and unexpected court battles. Let's start with child support. If your agreement says it can be modified based on circumstances, that might sound fair until life throws a curveball. You lose a job, you take a pay cut, or maybe your ex remarries and suddenly wants more money because your situation improved. Without a clear framework on what counts as a trigger for modification, you could end up back in court again and again, paying for lawyers to fight over the same issue you thought was already settled. Alimony can be even messy. Some people agree to spousal support without clearly defined limits on duration or conditions for termination. You think you'll pay for a few years, then find yourself writing checks a decade later. And if there's no clause about cohabitation or remarriage ending support, you could be funding someone's new life while struggling to build your own. Even worse, if your support agreement doesn't outline how adjustments are made, you might get hit with a court order to increase payments simply because your income changed, even if your living costs did too. Vague language is the enemy of peace. Every gray area in your support agreement is a future fight waiting to happen. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to untangle what you should have clarified from the start. You didn't just sign up for support. You signed up for uncertainty. And that's a bill that keeps collecting interest. You let them keep the house without considering the hidden costs. On the surface, giving up the house might feel like a loss. Emotionally, symbolically, even strategically, it was your home. Maybe you built it, renovated it, raised your kids in it. So when the settlement leaves it in their name, it stings. But here's the truth most people don't realize until it's too late. Walking away from the house might have saved you from a financial trap you never saw coming. Because houses don't just come with memories. They come with mortgages, with property taxes, with insurance premiums that rise every year, with roofs that need replacing, furnaces that break down, plumbing that fails at the worst time. And while your ex may have won the house in the settlement, what they really inherited was a long-term bill, one that doesn't stop growing. But on the flip side, if you kept the house, thinking it gave you stability, you might be facing the same burden. Many people don't calculate whether they can truly afford the house alone. Not just the monthly mortgage, but the maintenance, the taxes, the upkeep. Maybe you assumed you'd refinance. Maybe you thought keeping the kids in the same home was worth any cost. But now, you're watching your savings drain just to keep the lights on in a place that feels more like a museum of your old life than a fresh start. What you thought was the most valuable asset might actually be the most dangerous one. And in the long run, the emotional attachment to a property can blind you to the slow financial bleed happening every month. You didn't lose the house. You lost what it cost you to keep it, or to walk away from it without knowing what that truly meant. You didn't address future medical or insurance costs, and now they're coming back to bite you. During divorce negotiations, health insurance rarely gets the attention it deserves. Everyone's focused on custody, property, and support payments. But what most people don't realize is that losing spousal coverage can trigger a massive financial shift that doesn't hit until after the ink dries. If you were on your spouse's insurance, that benefit likely ends once the divorce is finalized. And replacing it? That's not just inconvenient. It can be brutally expensive. Some people assume they'll just hop onto a new plan. But if you're self-employed, between jobs, or nearing retirement, your options shrink fast. COBRA coverage might be available temporarily, but it's often shockingly expensive, sometimes 3 to 4 times what you were paying before. And even then, it only lasts for 18 to 36 months. After that, you're on your own. If you have pre-existing conditions or need ongoing care, private insurance premiums can become unsustainable. Now add in dental, vision, prescriptions, and copays. You go from having reliable coverage to drowning in out-of-pocket costs. And that's not even counting medical debt if something serious happens and your coverage isn't strong enough. The financial hit can be so steep it undoes everything else you fought to keep in the divorce: savings, stability, peace of mind. The worst part? It was avoidable. If medical coverage had been addressed in the settlement, if alternative plans had been discussed, if contributions to future premiums were negotiated, you might have had a cushion. Instead, you're left scrambling. It's not just the loss of a plan, it's the loss of protection. You didn't just divide your assets. You inherited a risk you weren't prepared for. And it's one that can grow more dangerous with every passing year. You didn't get a QDRO to split retirement properly, and that one missing document could end up costing you thousands. A QDRO, or Qualified Domestic Relations Order, is the legal form that allows retirement plans to divide assets between divorcing spouses without triggering taxes or penalties. Without it, your divorce decree might say your ex gets a portion of your retirement, or that you're entitled to part of theirs. But legally, nothing happens. The retirement plan administrator doesn't care what your divorce papers say. They only act on a valid QDRO. Here's where the trap gets dangerous. Some people assume their lawyer is handling it. Others forget entirely, thinking it's just another form that will get filed eventually. But if that QDRO never gets submitted, or if it's done wrong, the consequences hit hard. You might try to claim your share years later, only to find out the account is gone, already cashed out, or rolled over. Or worse, if you're the one paying, the plan might deny the transfer and leave you responsible for the amount personally, even if the account has dropped in value. And it's not just about filing the QDRO. It has to be approved by both the court and the retirement plan provider. One wrong phrase, one number out of place, and the document gets rejected. Meanwhile, time passes, markets shift, and accounts get harder to access. Some people end up chasing their share for years, only to be told it's too late. So you didn't miss a form. You missed a gate. A legal step that determines whether your retirement division actually happens or just sits on paper. And by the time you realize it wasn't handled, the money's often already moved on without you. You underestimated how much your taxes would change, and now you're stuck with bills you never saw coming. During the chaos of divorce, most people are focused on splitting assets, not realizing that how those assets are divided can completely reshape their tax obligations. You might think you're walking away with a fair deal, half the house, a chunk of the retirement, maybe some spousal support, but when tax season hits, the numbers don't look anything like what you expected. And by then, it's too late to fix. Let's start with spousal support. Before 2019, alimony payments were tax-deductible for the payer and considered taxable income for the recipient. But after the new tax law kicked in, that flipped. Now, if you're paying alimony, you don't get a deduction. And if you're receiving it, you don't pay taxes on it. Sounds like a win, right? Not always. Because settlements made without tax planning often leave one party footing a much bigger bill than anticipated. A few $1,000s in alimony might not seem like much until you realize it's coming out of your after-tax income, and you're not getting any of it back. Then there's the house. If your name was removed from the deed, but not the mortgage, you're still on the hook financially, with zero equity benefits. If you did get the house and sell it too soon, you might get hit with capital gains taxes, especially if you don't meet the 2-year primary residence requirement. Retirement accounts? Pulling money without a proper QDRO or rollover could trigger early withdrawal penalties and a massive tax bill. And don't forget about filing status. Switching from married filing jointly to single or head of household can raise your tax bracket and shrink your deductions. Suddenly, what looked like a stable post-divorce income now barely covers your expenses. You thought the settlement gave you a clean slate. But taxes don't care about clean slates. They care about paperwork, structure, and timing. And if those weren't handled with precision during the divorce, the IRS may come knocking long after your lawyer disappears. You agreed to vague language in the parenting plan, and now every disagreement turns into a battlefield. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. You just wanted the fighting to stop, So you nodded along when your ex's attorney suggested something like reasonable visitation or mutual agreement on holidays. It sounded flexible, even fair. Who wants to micromanage every detail when you're already emotionally exhausted? But what you didn't realize is that vague language isn't flexibility. It's a setup for endless conflict. Because when something isn't clearly defined, it becomes open to interpretation. And in family court, interpretation often favors the person with more time, money, or strategy to keep pushing. Suddenly, reasonable visitation becomes 2 hours once a week. Shared holidays turns into skipped birthdays. You find yourself arguing over pickup times, travel dates, even bedtime routines, because the plan left too much room for personal agendas. Worse, when things get ugly, and they often do, your ex can use that ambiguity as a weapon. They can refuse requests, delay responses, or forget agreed-upon times. And technically, they're not violating anything. Why? Because the agreement never spelled it out. So you end up going back to court, wasting time and money to fight for things that could have been locked down from the beginning. The courts don't love revisiting parenting plans. Unless there's a major change in circumstance, judges are hesitant to rewrite what they assume was mutually agreed upon. So now you're stuck in a maze of gray areas, trying to parent through loopholes and misinterpretations. And every time you push back, you risk being painted as difficult or uncooperative. You thought you were being peaceful. What you were really doing was signing off on uncertainty. And that one soft phrase, as agreed upon by both parties, became the spark for years of avoidable chaos. You walked away from assets just to keep the peace, and now you're living with the consequences. In the heat of a divorce, especially when emotions are high or kids are involved, it's easy to convince yourself that money doesn't matter. You just want it over. You want calm. So you tell your lawyer, let them have it. I don't want the fight. And maybe in that moment, it feels like the high road, like you're choosing maturity over mess. But fast forward a few years, and the silence you bought with that decision starts to echo. Because those assets you walked away from, whether it was the house, the pension, or a share of the investments, don't just disappear. They build value. They generate returns. They become leverage your ex can use to secure loans, buy property, or retire early. Meanwhile, you're playing catch-up, scrambling to rebuild a safety net that took decades to create. And every time a financial hardship hits, job loss, medical issue, economic downturn, you feel the gap you chose not to close. It gets worse when you see your kids benefiting from the lifestyle your ex now controls, built on money that should have been shared. Vacations you can't afford. A house in a better school district. You're not bitter, but it stings. Not because you wanted to take something away, but because you gave up your own security for a peace that didn't last. And here's the part no one tells you. Resentment builds quietly. You don't notice it at first. But every time you're forced to say no to something you could have once afforded, you remember. Every time you stretch your paycheck to cover basic needs, it creeps back in. You thought you were walking away from conflict. But what you actually did was sign a long-term deal with financial instability, and now it follows you into every chapter of your life. Divorce isn't just the end of a relationship. It's the beginning of a ripple effect that can last for years, sometimes decades. And what makes it so dangerous isn't always the big courtroom battles or dramatic showdowns. It's the quiet mistakes, the unchecked boxes, the moments when you're too drained, too overwhelmed, or too trusting to think clearly. That's when the damage happens. When you agree to terms that sound harmless but come back to haunt you. When you give up rights thinking you're buying peace, but what you're really buying is regret on a payment plan. What's most painful is that many of these consequences don't show up right away. The papers get signed, the keys get handed over, and for a brief moment you breathe. It's done. But months later, the cracks start forming. Your retirement doesn't stretch as far as you thought. The tax bill hits harder than expected. Custody turns into a chess match. And slowly, you begin to realize the real cost of the divorce wasn't in the legal fees. It was in what you didn't see coming. That's why these signs matter. Not to scare you, but to wake you up. Because once the dust settles, you'll be living with the outcome long after the lawyers move on. And if you're already seeing some of these signs in your own life, It's not too late to course correct. You can revisit agreements. You can get help. You can advocate for yourself in ways you didn't think you had the strength to before. Because this isn't about revenge or resentment. It's about clarity, about knowing what you gave up, why it happened, and how to make sure it doesn't keep taking from you. The haunting doesn't have to last forever, but only if you stop pretending it isn't there.